Our next storyteller is going to be Jan.
So my story is called Bondhead and Reconciliation, or a friend suggested to me 790 days that changed Turtle Island. I think that might be more accurate. When I was a young child, maybe grade 6, my teacher asked our class a question that has stayed with me all my life. She asked, "Who is a true Canadian?" I was proud. I had the right answer. I'm sure I put my hand up. I knew I was a true Canadian. After all, my family lines, I knew. My family lines were both Irish and Scottish, and they could be traced back to 1830s in Simcoe County. I was proud. I did not know then how many blinkers I had on, not then, nor throughout the rest of my education, my schooling. No one set me straight. Not family, not teachers. Why was that? Why the silence? At the very least, why no discussion? On the suggestion of a friend who knew this story circle was beginnings, she said to me, check out Bondhead. You might find it interesting. And so I did. I started a long journey. Sir Francis Bondhead's influence on the settlement in Simcoe County, Upper Canada, was profound. Some would say it was direction altering, and that is not a compliment. He was only in Upper Canada for a little over 2 years, 790 days. When he left, angry rebellion supporters were chasing him, and he was disguised, so that if they caught up to him, he would not be recognized. He boarded a ship in Kingston, which wasn't the plan. He was to go all the way to New York City. But he boarded a ship in Kingston to shorten the trek. There was no fanfare at the dock. There were no fancy speeches. There was only his relief. Researching the life and legacy of Sir Francis Bondhead has been my personal lens into the history I was never taught. I've been horrified at times. I was one of those people in the group screaming when we shared information. I've been angry a lot of the time, and of course sad. These truths were not part of the school curriculum. We were taught the Commonwealth official story in all its grandeur and moral high ground. What I know now, and I'm learning all the time, is the Anishinaabeg people have lived here and cared for this land for time immemorial, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They have lived sustainably here in relationship and respect with nature's balance and all life. Sir Francis Bondhead was born into an upper-class family in England in 1793. His father reportedly squandered most of the family wealth, and with creditors on his tail, he left his family in England and hightailed it to Europe to live incognito for the rest of his life. Not apparently uncommon. Francis improved his lot immensely when he married well. He married into a very wealthy and highly connected British family, the Head family. As all elites, he had a military education. He became Sir Francis in a rousing demonstration of his lassoing talents to King George. Interesting. At that time, he was assistant to the new Poor Law in Kent, and Sharon has described that so clearly, so well. I'll add just little connector pieces with my story. The Poor Law, as Sharon said, was Parliament's response to a peer to support the poor at the lowest cost possible. And fundamental to British society was their class system, was the elites and the working class, or at that time, as it was described, the deserving and the undeserving. That was just life. In his position as the assistant to the new poor law, Francis was responsible to administer this law, and he chose certain ways to do that. His job was to keep the peace among the unrest. The Parliament was getting very upset with all the rioting that was happening because it was a bad law. He was to keep the peace, and he was at all costs to ignore the deplorable living conditions. Bondhead's solution was to use military force, to silence the ringleaders, to listen to no complaints, and when he could not silence the ringleaders, to jail them for life. This template would be the one that he would use when he came to Upper Canada. It was sanctioned by the society he lived in. It worked for the elites. In 1833, when nobody could be found to replace the John Coburn's position, the previous lieutenant governor, Lady Simcoe, it's reported, in England by then, so she was Sir John Graves Simcoe's widow. She was at a function and she said to government officials, "Pick Bondhead, he'll get the job done." The job was to clear the land of Indians. They were an impediment to the Crown's goal to clear the resources for England. So first the Indians had to be moved aside, but it should look good. Of course, they could be convinced to assimilate, and the churches were already working in the country, so that could be helpful. The undeserving title from England was applied to the Indians as well. It is said that Sir Francis had a very strong opinion of himself. Without any prior government knowledge, he'd never been in the British Parliament, he didn't know his history, colonial history to date. No matter, he took charge. In early 1835, when he arrived in York, he would recognize status quo because patronage appointments were rampant everywhere, and this was familiar to him. After all, that's how he became lieutenant governor. Who you knew and supported mattered a great deal. The colony, he had decided, needed to be straightened out, and he started right away by pitting leaders in York against each other, government leaders. He also bullied anyone who disagreed with him, and he threatened the security of workers in muddy York with a number of laws, which, you know, if you're interested, you could check out. He was soon hated by everyone in York. Oh well, didn't seem to matter to him. In his estimation, the Indian displacement problem was the biggest problem. It would require more thinking and more strategizing. He wanted to look benevolent. He wanted to be seen in the history books as being helpful. But he also wanted to achieve his goals of clearing the Indians in a very timely fashion. Tick-tock. He had decided to canoe around Manitoulin Island and to visit leaders inland as well, and talk with elders and chiefs. And at that time, it is reported that he decided what he would do, what his solution would be, and he decided that he would give them Manitoulin Island to live out the rest of their days. His writings state that he found the Indian people, of course they were called Indians at that time, he found them noble. And he was sure they wouldn't last. He was sure they were going to die out. So he'd give them a safe place. He'd be benevolent. Of course, he didn't discuss this with them. He met with Chief Meskwaki. He met with Chief Ascends. He met with Chief Snake. His interest to start with became the Coldwater Reserve. The Coldwater Reserve, as we've also heard, was successful. Indians were adapting there. They were clearing land. They were setting up businesses. And so this was a perfect place to bring new settlers in. All he had to do was very important, was break all pre-existing agreements. His success would inform other groups. So other Indian groups that the government would be wanting to deal with would know how it would shake down. He would tell them just by his actions. And he also knew that the First Nations population, the Indigenous population, was weakened a great deal. It was weakened from war, from sickness, from disease. And some reports will even say that the population was 75% less than it had been even 20 years ago. So in his calculations, this would work for him. He had heard at the Coldwater Reserve that there was strong leadership. This concerned him. He knew there were leaders that lobbied for their people and that expected consensus decision-making and expected to be part of agreements. Sir Francis was not a leader for the people. He was not a leader for the land and the resources that were to go to England. He was a leader for the Crown. He was sure the Crown would thank him for his fabulous plan, and so he didn't even bother to ask London what they thought of it. He just went ahead. He left the Coldwater and Manitoulin trip. And he, as I said, he had been discussing things with the leaders there, and he left things on purpose very vague. So nobody really knew what was happening. The chiefs believed they could still purchase the land that they wanted. The chiefs believed they could still own the businesses that they had established. He left that very vague. And when he got back to York, he had what he called treaties drawn up for all the land around Lake Huron. In fact, they were like memos, and it wasn't his mandate, as we've said, to do this. But no matter, they were in legal ease. They were found decades later to be fraudulent documents. Bondhead's letters, for record for history books, I assume, reported that the chiefs begged him to buy the land from them, that he gave them a very advantageous offer. And as you've heard from Sharon, this is not the oral history story. It's not even close. There was no further consultation with Bondhead and the chiefs, and a meeting was called in York in November 1836. And at that meeting, Bondhead was unyielding about his position. Chiefs Meskwaki and Ascends were the two chiefs that I know that were present there. And they stayed for 2 days trying to be heard, trying to lobby for their rights, for their people's rights, for the land. And they were not heard. In the end, they believed that they could still buy the land, that they could still, the land that they wanted from the reserve, and also that they could keep the grist mill running. They believed that. They did not agree to expropriation of their land. But that is exactly what happened. Their land was expropriated by incoming settlers. There was a great deal of pressure from the Methodist Church at the time to resist this, but it was brief because Bondhead would not entertain any objections. And so eventually that storyline was just dropped. I know that my ancestors would have been in Simcoe County at that time. I know that my ancestors would have benefited from the government severing lots and giving them to people. I know that British colonialism just kept advancing with no reparations or what the decisions were. That's a hard thing to know and to figure out what to do with inside. I don't really know my ancestors' emotions or thoughts, but I do know they came as farmers. And the land that was highly valued was farming land, because the people who came had lost, my people who came had lost farmland that they valued a great deal in Scotland and Ireland. So they brought their pain with them, and they acquired new land here, and they carried on. There were lies, and there are lies in our history. There were hidden agendas. Racism was at play every single day on certain levels. The land was expropriated from the Chippewa. And by then, Bondhead had left. He got called back to England because he'd upset so many people in York as well, that England got wind of his tactics and they weren't impressed. And when he got back to England, apparently he was reprimanded for his tactics. They were an embarrassment to the crown, he was told. But the parliamentary leader is reported as saying, "You're such an odd sort of fellow, Bondhead." And that was it. When the information was taken to Parliament, Parliament rescinded nothing. They kept the land. They said nothing. Nor did they revisit the monetary agreements, because no funds that had been promised originally by Bondhead were ever set up. So nothing changed. No fair deal was reached. This is an important story to know. This is a foundational piece of the development of our country, of this area. This is not an honorable history. Back to the child in the grade 6 classroom and the question, who's a real Canadian? Well, it is certainly way more complex to share this kind of information with a child. The little girl I was needed this information, and much more, of course. I needed to know about the gifts of Anishinaabeg people. I needed to know about peoples who had knowledge of how to protect the land and sustain it. I needed to know a fair solution had been worked on. I needed to know that we can take responsibility for our decisions in a fair way together. And of course, I didn't learn that. But we're at a new time in history, and we can make new choices. Today, as settlers and various peoples from around the world here living in Canada, we need to allow ourselves, I believe, to be changed by the truths we're finding, to be changed and to work together for new ways forward that acknowledge this truth and that co-create new solutions. I think my ancestors would be proud if they knew that. I think that they would be grateful. So let's find a new way to move ahead together, to live in a good way. Thank you.